Hello everyone and welcome to today's Cambridge University Press CLT webinar. I'm very pleased to welcome as today's presenter Craig Thaine. Co-author of Cambridge English in Power, Craig's been involved in ELT for 30 years.
Sure.
He is Cambridge DTEFLA qualified and also has an MA Honours in Applied Linguistics. He's worked as a teacher and teacher trainer in many different countries, including England, Italy, Egypt, Sweden, and New Zealand. He's currently Director of Teacher Training at Languages International, Auckland, and is a Cambridge English Language Assessment Teaching Awards assessor for both the CELTA and Delta schemes. Over to you, Craig.
Thank you very much, Alistair. I hope everyone can hear me. And I'd like to say hello to everyone from literally all around the world. I've just been reading the chat, and there are people from Russia, China, South Africa, the Czech Republic, the United Arab Emirates, Poland, Holland, Sweden, Italy, Brazil, Greece, Bulgaria, and also the UK. But of course, I'm speaking from Auckland in New Zealand, so I think I'm probably the only person who's speaking or listening where it's nighttime. Also, it is, of course, winter here, so it's a little bit colder, but we've had a lovely winter's day. It's been sunny, but a little bit cold, but it's been a lovely day. So I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you all, to this truly international audience. And what I want to look at tonight is the topic of second language acquisition and manageable learning. In the webinar, I'll be looking at two theories of second language acquisition, or SLA. One of these concerns a theory where learners acquire language in a specific order. So it's all about order. Whereas the other theory, the second one that I'll look at, is more concerned with what a chaotic process acquiring a second language can be. For both of these theories, I'd like to look at the implications for us teachers in the classroom. But I think it's useful perhaps if we begin by looking at what we mean by a little bit of terminology. So I'd like to start with the word acquisition. In the past, a distinction was made between learning and acquisition. So often learning was perceived as learning about language, so learning grammar terminology, rules of form, the order in which to put words, that kind of thing. And the idea was that with this information in our brains, we kind of applied this information when we were thinking about a second language in order to create new examples. By contrast, acquisition is the idea of just being able to use a language and pick it up in some kind of communicative situation. Often it was associated with the expression to learn a language by ear, that you could just pick it up, that you would somehow absorb it or acquire it. So this contrast is often associated with the theorist, second language acquisition theorist, Stephen Krashen. So he made this clear distinction. But over time, theorists have felt that this distinction was perhaps not black and white. So there were a lot of kind of gray areas and a lot of overlap. And so these days, the two terms tend to be used interchangeably. So here's a quote from Sean Lowen, who's written a book on instructed second language acquisition. And in effect, acquisition and learning is now seen as this notion of an increase in L2 knowledge and or proficiency. So this idea that we know a little bit more about the language, but we're also able to use it in a slightly better way. So during the seminar, the webinar, I'll be using the terms learning and acquisition interchangeably, and they mean the same thing, this idea of an increase of knowledge or ability or competence. So I thought it would be useful to make that distinction. The second term that I think that we perhaps should look at is the term interlanguage. Now, Richardson Schmidt in their Dictionary of Applied Linguistics define this as the type of language produced by second and foreign language learners who are in the process of learning a language. So in effect, interlanguage is any language that is produced by a learner from when they first start out learning that second language right through to the point where they're becoming really quite proficient. And sometimes, obviously, interlanguage is not correct. It's not what's considered standard correct language, perhaps because a learner is borrowing a form or a word order from their first language and applying that to the second language. So it's not entirely correct, but it's perhaps the utterance is perhaps comprehensible. We can understand what they're saying. And then often learners will use communication strategies. So an example of this would be when the learner doesn't actually know the correct word, so they give a definition, they paraphrase to explain the meaning that they want to convey. And so this is a communication strategy. Whereas obviously someone who is a proficient user of the second language would know the exact word to use. Okay, so this is what we mean by interlanguage. So I thought those two words, acquisition versus learning and interlanguage, it was useful just to clarify what we meant by these, because I'll be using them throughout the webinar. So I'd like now to move on to the first task, and I'd like you to think about and perhaps type in some answers to these three questions. Do learners always acquire what you teach in the classroom? Do they sometimes struggle to learn easy grammar points? And why do you think this is the case? So could you perhaps type your ideas, your answers to these questions into the chat box? So we'll just wait a minute for people to type. Good. So yeah, some really good some answers here that I couldn't agree with more. The interesting thing is I don't think I have done this as a live seminar, and I don't think anyone has ever answered the first question with yes, and I don't see any yes answers here. I'm trying to scan and skim read these very, very quickly. I mean, if someone did answer yes to the first question, I think I would then say to them, what's your secret? I want to know what your secret is, that your learners always acquire what you teach. So there's a lot of easy grammar. A lot of you are saying that, there are easy grammar points often that learners don't pick up. And this really leads me to looking at the first theory. But before I do that, I want to actually just give a little background to my interest in this particular area. It's a personal interest. So one thing I would like to emphasize is that I am not a researcher. I'm a teacher, like the rest of you. I'm a teacher and a teacher trainer. So I am not involved with second language acquisition research. However, I'm very interested in second language acquisition, and I'm interested in theory, because I think that as a teacher, we can learn a lot from different theories. So this is my focus here. I am reporting on what other theorists and researchers have printed or put out there. So these are not my ideas. I'm reporting on other people's ideas. And the reason for that is that I am a second language speaker myself, so I can speak some Italian, as you will find out. And I think there are some Italian speakers here. The other thing is that with working with second language learners, English language learners, I've always had an instinctive feeling that they have some kind of internal syllabus. I've often felt that I was teaching a grammar point, but in some ways they weren't ready for that grammar point because there was some kind of syllabus in their brain that actually didn't match what I was teaching. And in fact, when I did my master's study about 20 odd years ago, One of the things that I studied was a theory of what is teachable. So this links into this idea of what second language learners are ready for, what they are ready to learn. Okay, so what I'd like to do is move from that point, look at the first of the two theories. And this one is called processability theory, and it comes from a German researcher, Martin Pienemann. And in fact, this is what I studied when I was studying on my MA. Back then it was called the teachability hypothesis. But since then, Martin Pienemann has developed his ideas further, and he has come up with this idea of what he calls processability theory. So what I'd like to run through now are kind of the key points. It's a very kind of brief overview of what processability theory involves. So the first point that Pienemann makes is that there is a part of our brain that processes language. So I think that nobody would doubt this, that something, there is a part of our brain that deals with language, or maybe parts of our brain. So that's one thing. And what he indicates is that the part of our brain that deals with language, what he calls the language processor, seems to acquire certain language items before others. And he calls this a developmental order. So there are different kind of language points that occur before others and that we're ready for others, and we acquire these before others. And we'll look at, someone has already in the chat has mentioned the example that I think will be familiar to everyone, which we'll look at in a minute. For certain language points, for example, question forms, there is a developmental order. So obviously there are different kinds of question forms, and we'll look at these in a minute. And learners will learn these, they tend to learn them. His research has shown that they learn these in a fairly specific order. So again, this is linking into this idea that I myself was interested in, and this is why I got very excited when I read about Pienemann's work when I was doing my MA, is it taps into this idea that learners do have some kind of internal syllabus that allows them to learn certain language items but not others, so that there is this kind of specific order. And what this means, of course, it is if you're trying to teach a language form before learners are ready for it, and in other words, before it matches their internal syllabus, it may mean that they can't acquire the form. And of course, that's very interesting, I think, for us as language teachers, because in effect, if we're sort of, we teach, we put a lot of energy into teaching, and we always hope that our learners are going to learn or acquire what it is we're teaching. But of course, if they're not ready for it, well, it's kind of interesting to know that. So perhaps it means that we can avoid certain forms and focus on the ones that are perceived as being learnable. So this is the example which someone has already mentioned in the chat. And I think this gives a certain degree of weight to Martin Pienemann's ideas. It's very interesting that at beginner level, we teach the S for plural forms, and we also will teach the S for the third person singular of verbs. Now, what's interesting is that learners seem to pick up the plural S when it's just put on the end of a noun reasonably quickly and without problems. And the thing that, of course, mystifies me, and I think a lot of other teachers, is even when learners are at B2, but even sometimes at C1 level, they still are not using the S on the third person singular of the simple present. And that is I think, an interesting phenomenon. Because English, obviously, the verb forms don't change a lot, and in the present simple there's just one little morpheme, this little S, that learners have to learn, but it seems to take them forever to be able to use that correctly all the time. Even though we teach it at beginner level, we revise it at elementary level, pre-intermediate, intermediate, in just about every coursebook level that you could mention, the S morpheme comes up for the simple present. It's revised again and again and again, but often, yeah, learners are just not able to use it. So the final point that Pieneman makes is that although there is an internal syllabus and there's this kind of specific order of language points, there is some variation and learners will follow different trajectories. So this diagram here shows what he means. So the bars that go across, the horizontal bars, they would show different language points, a different order, whereas the arrows are showing that there is a different trajectory, so there's a degree of variation. So it's not all language that is learnt in a specific order. There is some variation, different trajectories, but there are certain things that learners appear to learn in a certain order. So let's have a look at a particular language point that Martin Pieneman has actually done some research on, and this is question formation in English. So what I've got here are there are 5 question forms. Some of these are examples of what I previously called interlanguage. In other words, they're not entirely correct, but they're language forms that learners will use in the meantime before they actually become correct in that particular form. So what this is, this, she see this, what has she seen, what is this? What I'd like you to do, this is your second task, is put them in what you think could be a developmental order, from the first form that is used by learners to the form that you think is the last one used by learners. Okay, so what's number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? So if you could type your answers into the chat box. Okay, some good answers here. I think, yeah, a lot of them are correct. I think you've got the right idea. And I think it's interesting. He's done a lot of research on this, whereas I think that as language teachers, we know this almost immediately. So I'll just wait another couple of minutes so people get enough opportunity, everyone gets an opportunity to contribute. So that's great, fantastic. Thank you for your answers. That's wonderful. So this is what Pieneman's research indicated, which I think agrees with most of your answers. So the first form that learners would be able to use is just this, probably with a rising intonation. She see this. So here they're using a subject, verb, object order that we normally associated with an affirmative statement rather than a question. Then what they next do, as in sort of an extra layer of complexity, is starting to introduce a WH word of some kind: what, who, where, when, how. Then the next step is that they introduce the copular verb, the verb to be here, and you can see that the learners are able to invert this. And then the most complex form, the one that they would use last of all, is using a second auxiliary verb to form the question. So here the auxiliary is has plus the main verb seen. So this is what Pieneman noted. He said that learners attempting to use the auxiliary second, in other words the most complex form, before they are at level 5, in other words before they are ready for the structure, before their internal syllabus is ready for it, have been found to produce the following interlanguage variants: what she's seen, what has she seen, what she has seen, she's seen this. So this is one small language area where Pieneman is able to determine a specific developmental order. And what he's saying is that this is the same for all learners, regardless of their first language. So I don't think he's done a huge number of grammar areas, but it is an interesting point that learners from different nationalities tend to learn something in a specific order. So this is where I actually come to my own experience as a second language learner when I was learning Italian living in Italy. So forgive me, the people who are Italian, I hope I've got this right. What was interesting is quite early on, I remember studying direct and indirect objects. And often I think if you look at the grammar syllabus for a lot of languages, if there are direct and indirect objects in that language, they're often focused on fairly early on in the syllabus. They certainly are in English language courses. Now, what's interesting is that what I was trying to say is something like the first one, I'll send it to him. Now the first example in Italian there, io lo mando a lui. So the io in brackets is I, lo stands for it, mando is the verb, a lui is to him. I've put the io, the io in brackets because in Italian you often don't need to use the pronoun. Now, when I was maybe at kind of intermediate level, I was using the first form reasonably well, despite the fact that I had been taught all the different forms. But as I tried to experiment a little bit more, I was also using the second form, which was io, I, and then gli, ye, means to him, and then lo, it, mando. Thank you, Simona. That's nice to have your vote of confidence in my Italian. I've just noticed it. Okay, so this is what I started using, but in fact, this is incorrect. The correct form, in fact, is the final one. So what happens is, in Italian, if you want to put the indirect and the direct object together, you actually have to create a whole new word, which you can see in bold there, which is liello. So what's interesting is I actually studied that when I was kind of probably elementary pre-intermediate level, say B1 level, and I was hearing it. I think it was certainly being exposed to it all the time because I was living in Italy, but it wasn't really until I was at kind of B2, almost C1 level, that I was able to really kind of deal with this and start actually using it. And what this suggests to me is that in some way my internal Italian syllabus wasn't actually ready for the correct form. So what I did in the meantime is that I used the first form, which is okay, that is correct. And that of course is similar to the English structure, so that's okay. But then I also was using the second form, but of course that was incorrect. And I have to say that Italians are very gracious when you speak their language, and no one really corrected me until finally I was kind of curious. I think I got to a point where I felt that I was getting things wrong, so eventually I asked. On the other side, it's exactly the same problem, and you can see that the last form, the correct form, te lo spiego, that's explain. So io, I, te, to you, lo, it, spiego. That was the form that I was not able to use. So that's just it with a different pronoun. So this was very interesting to me, the fact that there was this grammar point that I had studied and I was not able to use. And the other interesting thing is that I was exposed to this all the time. I was hearing these examples all around me, but I just did not pick them up. So that seems to suggest that my internal Italian syllabus simply was not ready. So this was one of the reasons why I found Pieneman's theory particularly attractive, because it made sense of this experience for me. So what Sean Lowen says, talk in discussing processability theory, just because a grammatical structure is taught in the classroom does not mean that learners will be able to use it productively unless they are developmentally ready. So let's look at what we as teachers can take from processability theory. To my mind, it confirms many of our intuitions. Learners, and I've noticed that some of you have made comments along these lines in the chat, that learners sometimes aren't ready for new language. And so what this means, what this suggests to me, is that we as teachers shouldn't overload learners with language that they're not ready for. But by the same token, we shouldn't overload them with too much language. I think this certainly, I remember when I first started teaching, I thought, oh, there's so much my learners have to know, that I think I taught too much vocabulary, too much grammar, and in fact I overloaded them. So what we should aim to do is make learning in some way manageable for learners. So giving them bite-sized bits of language, of grammar and vocabulary that they can cope with, so it's not too much. It also suggests to me, to my mind, that the way of checking learning is by means of productive activities. So in effect, it's this idea that the proof of the pudding is in the eating, or in the case of second language learning, the proof of the pudding is in the speaking. So really, I think we can say that learners have really got a new bit of language when they can actually use it reasonably confidently in some kind of productive activity, like maybe a role play, or maybe when they're writing a letter or an email or something along those lines. It's also, I think, interesting to think about processability theory in terms of learning resources. So it suggests that it would be useful for us to know what learners are capable of learning and using, because ideally, if we have got an idea of what learners' internal syllabus might be, and we can teach to that internal syllabus, well, obviously the learning experience is going to be a lot more productive and satisfying for both us as teachers, but more importantly for the learners. So obviously focusing on grammar and vocabulary that is beyond learners' level does not optimize their learning effort. Now, I've noticed that some of you have mentioned in the chat the Common European Reference Framework, and this already is beginning to give us some insight into what is learnable. But also, research has been done with Cambridge English, or Cambridge English have done the research, I should say, in terms of determining a learner corpus, which is then informed what is called English profile. So I'd just like to have a look at that, because this actually is providing us with a certain amount of information in terms of what is learnable, what can be considered manageable language at certain CEFR levels. So the learner corpus is a huge database which includes information, or language I should say, taken from Cambridge exams. So Cambridge have taken about 200,000 exam scripts, 55 million words, and they've taken this from 143 first language backgrounds. So from this, they have created the corpus, so this huge database of learner language. Now, the English Profile Corpus, or the English Profile Project, means that that researchers have been able to look at the learner corpus, and they've been able to look at vocabulary and grammar, and they've analyzed it, and they've been able to tag it according to the Common European Reference Framework levels. Now, what's interesting about these corpus samples that are taken from learners is they are an indication of what learners can produce at a certain level. So if researchers are looking at an exam script which has been done by a learner who has passed Cambridge First, this would indicate that they are at B2 level. So the language that those learners are producing in their exam scripts are examples of language that learners can actually produce at that level, or are capable of producing at that level. So obviously this gives us a lot of insight into what learners are able to learn at different levels. It is, I should really make the point here that this is not saying that English Profile is like Pieneman's internal syllabus, all I'm saying is that the English profile is giving us a little bit more insight in terms of what the internal syllabus might be. So when I worked on Cambridge English and Power, we referred to Cambridge English Profile all the time. So this informed our language selection, particularly our selection of vocabulary. So here's another task for you. I was recently, about 2 months ago, I was teaching a group of elementary level learners at my school here in Auckland. And I was using some learning resources, and I was teaching a lexical set of jobs, different kinds of jobs. So what I would like you to do is look at this list of vocabulary and decide which ones you would teach at A2 level. It may in fact be easier in terms of typing to just actually list the ones that you would not teach, which you think maybe are too difficult for A2 level learners from this particular set. Or maybe you might think that they're all teachable, that they're all fine. So if you could just have a look at that and type into the chat box the words maybe that you think would be too difficult for A2 level learners. Okay, someone's mentioned they've got no experience of A2. That's all right. Just take a break. That's absolutely fine, and you can have a look at the answers. So if you don't have a lot of experience at A2, that's not a problem. Just take a break, and we'll wait for some answers, and then we'll look at what people have to say. True. The professional context can actually play an important role. Okay, someone is limiting it to 10. That's interesting. Okay. Right, there are quite a few common ones coming up. Okay, someone's mentioned if A1 are meant to produce the 13th of August. That's very true. I would agree with that. Okay, so flight attendant and receptionist, vet, journalist. Okay, good. So I agree with quite a few of these. So so this selection here of words, in fact, was from a learning resource that I was using. And I did feel that there were maybe quite a few, there are about 23 words there, and I also felt that some of them might be difficult. So what I did is I checked them in English Profile, and this is what I found. So the words in blue with B1 beside them, in terms of the research that's been done with English Profile, indicate that those words are suitable for learners at B1 level, or I should say not suitable, but that learners are able to produce them at B1 level. The other words were all fine for A2 level. So there are 9 words there that are perceived as being above level. Another variation here is like someone has questioned the word architect, and I think that certainly this might be the case with certain first languages. So, for example, in Italian, the word architect is architetto. So it really is a cognate, and I think that maybe when there are cognates, if the word in English is very similar to the learner's first the word in the learner's first language, then okay, perhaps it is learnable. But in terms of kind of looking at an international baseline of what's learnable, English Profile does actually provide some useful information. So this is what we included in Cambridge English and Power, and our selection here is based on what was learnable, or what learners could produce in the learner corpus, and was tagged as being A2 level in this lexical set. So this is what we've included. Now, of course, if you're teaching in a context where there are words that are cognates, well, then you can add to this list slightly. And obviously, if you've got an A2 level learner whose job is psychotherapist, obviously you would teach that word to that learner because they're going to be very interested in learning it. So there are some kind of contextual factors that would perhaps augment this kind of core list. But I think it is interesting to start out with a core. So I want to look at another task, and this again is looking at data from English Profile and looking at future forms at A2 level. So which of the following future forms and their uses do you think an A2 level learner is able to use? So if you could type your answers into the chat box. Okay, the first three going to all of them except the future continuous. Okay, so a lot of you are saying the first three, which is exactly what I thought. But here's the interesting and shocking information. That the researchers found that A2 level learners were able to use all four, including the future continuous. So this is what they had to say. One surprising piece of evidence that has emerged from our research at the A2 level is early use of future continuous. This structure is not normally taught until B levels, and yet learners appear to be able to produce it successfully within limited contexts of time. I'll be waiting for you. This is by a Portuguese speaker of English at using the Key English test. We'll be starting at 12 o'clock this afternoon by a Chinese learner. So I was quite amazed when I read that, but obviously they're working with a lot of data, so they're not saying that just 2 learners from the corpus, these are just 2 examples. So in order to reach this conclusion, it suggests that quite a few A2 level learners were using the future continuous in this way. So the learner corpus in English Profile is providing us with more insight in terms of what learners can actually learn. And if you want to read more about this, there's a link down there, English Profile, Grammar Gems. Researchers are putting out periodic reports on interesting information that they're finding as they conduct the research. So, very quickly, let's look at task 5. Do learners sometimes use language that surprises you? So I want to move on now and look at the second of the 2 theories, and these questions are an introduction to that. Do they sometimes take 1 step forward and 2 steps back? And how do you account for this? Why do you think this is the case? So again, if you could type your answers into the chat box. Okay, so broadly speaking, I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to move forward now. But broadly speaking, it seems that most of you seem to be agreeing that learners do sometimes use language that surprises you, and a lot of you are referring to environmental factors that play a part in this. So this leads us into the second of the 2 theories, complexity theory, and this comes from Diane Larson Freeman, some of the research that she's been doing. And she's looked at this starting from first language acquisition studies, so the way in which we acquire our first language. And it suggests that what happens is that a child's language emerges over time. In other words, children, babies, don't study grammar rules. I don't remember being taught the present perfect when I was 18 months old. So that makes a lot of sense. So what she's interested is a change in focus from seeing language learners as computers. So this idea that somehow information goes into the language processing part of our brains, it's worked on by rules, and then out comes an utterance. So it's like information in, processing, information out. So what we'd call a computational model, as though our brains and our language processes are like computers. So she's saying that language learning is not like that. And it doesn't involve, obviously, learning rules. What she wants to emphasize this idea is that language abilities emerge in real time when learners work on communicative tasks. And again, thinking about my own second language learning experience, there were times when somehow I would be speaking, I would be saying something, and I would perhaps suddenly use a new form, and it was like something fell into place, the penny dropped. So this idea that something new emerged in real time when I was actually trying to communicate in that second language. Diane Larson-Freeman emphasizes the idea that language learning is a dynamic process, that there's this idea of constant change going on, that it's not static. So this would perhaps account for this idea of 1 step forward, 2 steps back, then maybe 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So there's a constant changing in terms of our abilities and our competence. And also, and a lot of you have kind of referred to this already, that it's an adaptive process where the language users react to their environment. But I mean, of course, the environment in this day and age is kind of everywhere. People have mentioned gaming, online activities. But also, I think we can think of the classroom as being an environment, and other speakers can often be the learner's classmates. So this will affect the way that language emerges over time. And again, there's this idea that language takes shape in the way that it is used. So it's in the speaking, in the using of language, that we begin to create forms and meaning. And linguistic structures and patterns emerge in this process. Okay, so complexity theory is linked to an idea of chaos theory. So this suggests a degree of disorganization. However, complexity sometimes can be organized. So that seems a little bit strange, I'm sure, because the two things seem to contradict each other. And Diane Larson-Freeman has this lovely metaphor, which I think is fantastic. So she says, organized complexity involves a large number of parts, but the parts work together to produce a coherent structure from their interaction, such as with individual verbs coming together to form a flock. And I was very struck by this metaphor, this idea that learning a second language is like a flock of birds. So there's all this beating of wings and chaos, but somehow, as you can see on the slide there, a kind of a shape and a form emerges, and it's dynamic. And despite the fact it's made up of all these kind of little birds flying together. So I think that this was a fantastic metaphor, and it made a lot of sense to me. So what can we take from this idea of complexity theory? So I think it confirms this intuition that we have, that each of our learners is individual, and obviously they've got different language needs. It also suggests that each learner's interlanguage is different and often surprising. As we've noted, and you've noted in the chat, that learners will often come up with surprising phrases, expressions, or they'll perhaps use a little bit of grammar in a way that you thought was maybe not possible. And I think we also understand this idea that input doesn't equal output. So, I mean, we teach as well as we possibly can, but we don't always see that language in the learner's output. So learning is not a neat step-by-step process. We teach a grammar point, the learners learn it, and then we move on. And we know that they'll, keep that initial grammar point as they keep learning more. It's far messier than that. It's not lockstep. It's an untidy process. And this idea that learners will often take one step forward and two steps back, and they need to adapt and restructure their interlanguage. And again, this is something that I felt when I've learnt second languages. I've often felt that I've been doing really well and I've made fantastic progress, and then 3 days later I feel as though I'm just hopeless and nothing's working. So that was something that I could identify with. So what does this mean for us in the classroom, we as teachers? So I think that complexity theory says that we need to respond to learners' emerging needs as a program unfolds, but also as the lesson unfolds. So we need to be responsive in this way and be listening to our learners. And it also suggests that we need to give feedback on learner language. So this is associated with an idea of learning-oriented assessment, which is this idea where you're listening or tuning into your learners in order to help them determine what their language needs actually are, so that you can actually help them in the next step of their learning process. If you're interested in finding out more on learning-oriented assessment, at the end of last year I did a webinar on that, which is available from the CUP website. Teachers also need to personalize learning as much as they possibly can. So we kind of need to be in touch with our learners with either tutorials. Now we can have the tutorials face-to-face, but in this day and age we can perhaps use a learning management system or email or some kind of e-communication. So we want to help them in a tutorial situation, but also we want to help them to set specific goals. And learners should be provided with communication activities that will allow them to adapt and shape their language. So in effect, we need to give learners opportunities for new language to emerge in the way that Diane Larson-Freeman indicates. So we now get to a kind of a contrast of these two theories, and what kind of intrigues me about the two of them is the fact that in some ways they seem to contradict each other. So processability theory seems to be talking about an idea of order, that there's this developmental order that learners learn particular language items in a certain order, whereas complexity theory is saying, well, no, it's all chaos and it's all untidy and messy. Processability theory seems to suggest some kind of collective language development, that learners, irrespective of their first language, are all learning in a particular order, whereas complexity theory emphasizes this idea of individual language development, that learning is in a second language is in some way personalized. And then processability theory seems to sort of prescribe what language you learn this first, then that, then that, then that. Whereas complexity theory is looking at this idea, there's no idea of saying this is the list you will learn. The idea is more that language would emerge. So what's interesting is when you put them together, they seem like opposites, but to my mind, put together in this way, they actually create a broad picture of what second language acquisition might be about. So these are kind of the conclusions that I reached in terms of contrasting the theories. So I think that learners tend to prefer a language program that has some kind of syllabus, and because that gives them a sense of direction. So processability theory offers some insight into the kind of shape that syllabus might have. It also suggests that language learning needs to be manageable, that whatever syllabus we have, we don't want to make it too difficult, and we don't want to make it too much in the sense of asking learners to learn more language than they're ready for. However, complexity theory suggests that we also need to be flexible and responsive to learners' individual needs. So we need the structure of the syllabus, the sense of direction, but by the same time we need to be reflexive and flexible and responsive. And it also suggests that learners need to be provided with interactive opportunities in order for language, the second language, to be able to emerge. And both theories emphasize the central role of learners producing language in the acquisition learning process. So together, I think the two theories actually provide quite a nice overview, quite a broad overview of what second language acquisition and learning is about, and the kinds of issues that we need to think about in the classroom. So to come back to my initial point of view, that we're looking at these two theories, that they complement each other and perhaps give a wider view. And I think that they both have useful implications for the classroom, but also for the kind of resources that we can use with our learners. And then finally, they suggest that we need to make learning both manageable and responsive. So the manageability coming from processability theory and the responsiveness coming from complexity theory. And this is why I think that reading theory is interesting for teachers, because I think it can inform our practice. It can make us think about what we do in the classroom, maybe in a slightly different way. And I think that that is useful. So as I said at the outset, these are not my theories. They're theories that I've read about that I'm sharing with you. And I hope that maybe there's something that you've been able to take from them that is of value, and they perhaps make you think a little bit about your practice and the ways in which you can perhaps change it or adapt it or try something new. So these are the references, the key references, the first two in particular. The Gass and Mackey book was where I read about the two theories, and then Sean Lowen has published a very useful introduction, a very accessible introduction to second language acquisition in the classroom. So that's all from me at this stage, and I think we've got about 10 minutes left for some questions.
Thanks very much, Craig. So yes, we've got a few questions in, and remember, if you're in the audience, please do send through your questions. So I had a question from Christine Sutter-Chandley, who, going back to what you were talking about with L1 and L2, was wondering about how we can discourage learners from comparing with their L1, or should we actually encourage them to make comparisons between their L1 and their L2?
I think probably it can be useful to make some comparison. I think it depends on the age of the learners. So certainly with very young learners, I don't have a lot of experience teaching young learners, but my experience of them has been that it's not particularly useful. But I think that sort of from, teenagers, certainly through to adults, it can be very, very useful if you're teaching in a monolingual situation to make that kind of contrast. It always depends, of course, on the degree of knowledge that learners have about their first language. That can sometimes be tricky. But I don't have a problem with it. I think that anything that's useful in terms of making some information about language comprehensible to learners is a good thing. And if that involves using the learner's first language to make a direct contrast, well, I think that's very, very helpful. I certainly, in my own experience learning a second language, have done that. I have directly contrasted Italian with English. And at certain points, making that contrast was useful because I thought, okay, in English we use the present perfect to get that idea across. But in Italian, they use the simple present to get the same idea across. So understanding that I actually found useful. So yeah, I don't have a problem with it.
Okay, thanks. Question now from Stephen Lander, who says, processability theory seems to be more applicable to writing and complexity theory to speaking. Would you agree with that?
I'm not sure if it does necessarily. I mean, it's a very interesting question. I mean, the research that Pieneman has done, I mean, just on the question forms, I mean, that to my mind suggests spoken language more than written language. And I think he does his research where learners are actually performing communicative tasks of some kind, where they're being asked to produce language. I don't know whether he himself makes a distinction between writing and speaking. So I'm not sure if it would necessarily be more applicable to written language. Um, there's nothing in the articles that I've read that would suggest that, but it is an interesting thought, an interesting concept. Um, Certainly, complexity theory seems to suggest more by way of spoken language. This idea of language emerging, I think that that does suggest speaking in a way. So I can understand how you could form that impression. It would be quite easy to do so, but I'm not sure if that is Martin Pieneman's intention.
Okay, thanks. A question now from Jacob Olesiuk, who says, do you think that teaching collocations helps organize lexical information in the brain of the learner?
Yes, I think it does. It in effect, the other thing about collocations or lexical phrases, it gives them these sort of useful little chunks of language that learners can often pull out. I mean, I think that maybe collocations and lexical chunks are, I mean, a lot of what Pieneman is looking at obviously is grammar, and he was looking at, if you remember from the diagram, these idea of variations, and I think that collocations, lexical chunks, these things here are probably examples of things that would be variations that would account for the different trajectory of two individual learners.
Okay, thanks. That ties in, I guess, with a question from David Howe, who asks whether some learners are naturally better than others, or whether slow learners can learn about learning from what the fast learners are doing correctly.
Um, I think, well, certainly, I think so. I mean, it's often the challenge with learners is often teaching them how to learn, in effect. But to come back to the first question, I think there are people who seem to have a natural, the expression we use in English, they have an ear for language. Um, I mean, if I think of my own example here, it took me kind of 2, 3 years to get really kind of confident, reasonably accurate and reasonably confident in terms of speaking Italian. I had a colleague when I was working in Rome called Penny, and she had been brought up bilingual, speaking French and English, but she'd also lived in North Africa, so she'd learnt Arabic as a child. So she had an incredible facility for learning second languages, and she arrived in Rome and was speaking pretty good Italian after 3 months, which I found uniquely frustrating. I, slaved away for 3 years, and after three months, she's almost at the same level. So, based on that experience, I think that there are some people who are slightly better at learning languages. They seem to have an ability, a capacity for it. But I also believe that anyone can learn a second language. And I think that the question signals nicely the idea of this idea of actually teaching learners how to learn. And I think that this can be an important part of a teacher's job with certain learners or even certain groups of learners, that they actually don't quite know how to approach the second language learning process. So often part of our job is giving them useful hints and strategies to actually help them learn, how to memorize language effectively, how to revise it, how to get extra practice, those kinds of things, how to record vocabulary. All of these things, I think, anything that can help learners in this way is really useful.
Thanks, Craig. Now, you're, as I mentioned in the introduction, an author of Cambridge English Empower, new Cambridge coursebook. Could you tell us a little, please, about how you've put into practice in Cambridge English Empower what you've been talking about today, please?
Well, a lot of it had to do with the selection of the language and the actual syllabus. So what we have tried to do in particular is make the material in Empower manageable for learners. And therefore, the result of that is also manageable for teachers. So, I mean, if you think back to the vocabulary set that we looked at, the jobs, I mean, we've done that kind of analysis on all the vocabulary that is taught for productive use throughout all levels. It's been researched in that way. So we've made sure that whatever vocabulary we're focused on is vocabulary we know that learners are able to produce at A2 level or B1 level or whatever. So I think that, you know, this means that teachers can have confidence that they're working with material that is going to be manageable for their learners. It's not going to overwhelm them in terms of words being words that are too difficult. And we've also tried to restrict the amount of vocabulary, so they're not huge long lists. And also with grammar, we've tried to make sure that the grammar data is still emerging, but we've tried to make sure that the grammar syllabus is manageable. It's the kind of syllabus that teachers and learners would expect to find at any sort of given level. But we've also tried to structure the tasks in such a way that they are easy to learn. But the other dimension from both processability theory and complexity theory that Adrian and I have applied in Cambridge English and Power is this idea that learners are given plenty of opportunity to actually use language. There's a great variety of speaking activities where they can actually produce language. So certainly in terms of complexity theory, if you are hoping that language is going to emerge in communicative situations, well, there are plenty of opportunities in the material for that to happen with learners.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Craig. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for in today's session. But before we go, I'd just like to tell you about some of the other webinars we've got coming up in the next 2 weeks. So next week, on Tuesday the 23rd, back at the usual time of 3 p.m. UK time, Teresa Clementson will be talking about effortless fluency for your high-level learners. Then the very next day, on Wednesday the 24th, Adrian Doff will be back for a repeat of his webinar on developing speaking skills. And we'll be sharing links to sign up for those in the chat right away. And don't forget that your certificate of attendance will be sent out automatically later this week, so you really don't need to email us to ask about those. If you miss any of those webinars or want to catch up on any of the previous ones, don't forget that we share the recordings on our YouTube channel and on our blog. You can keep up with all our news on our Facebook page and on Twitter. So thank you very much, everybody. Thanks particularly to you, Craig, for another very interesting session. And we'll be back next week.
I'd just like to say thank you. I'd just like to say thank you to everyone who's listened in. I've enjoyed talking to you all, and I've enjoyed reading your comments in the chat. It's been a nice experience for me. So good night from New Zealand, and I hope you all have a lovely day.
Thanks very much, Craig. You too.
Bye.